Hello, fantastical beings. This week we have another episode of the Murky Paintwater series. If you aren't familiar with the series yet, it is a series in which I talk about a true crime case whilst painting. Now, of course, we have to start off with a disclaimer about this episode, because this episode discusses mature content matter which some viewers may find offensive, so viewer discretion is advised. Today, we will be talking about the death of 4 teenagers in Clear Lake City, also known as the Clear Lake Murders. Now, let's be honest, every murder case is horrifying in its own way, but this case will just give you shivers all over. For this case, we travel back in time to March 31st, 1986, the day on which Christine Paolilla was born. Christine was born on Long Island, New York, as the second child to Lori and Charles Paolilla. Lori was a stay-at-home mom and Charles was a construction worker. This setting would be seen to many as ideal for a child to grow up in, but Christine's family life would unfortunately not remain so ideal. When Christine was 2, her father, Charles, died in an unfortunate construction accident. This led Lori to abusing drugs to cope with the pain of losing Charles and the stress of raising 2 young children alone. Because of Lori's drug use, she eventually lost custody of Christine and her older brother. Christine and her brother were put in the care of their maternal grandparents, who also gained the custody over the children. Now, as if this isn't enough to cope with as a young child, Christine was diagnosed with alopecia when she was just 5 years old. Alopecia is a condition that causes hair to fall out, and not just the hair on top of your head, but also the hair in your eyebrows and eyelashes, causing a strikingly different appearance to people suffering from alopecia. To hide the balding on top of her head, Christine would often wear wigs from a young age, and because of her poor vision, she wore thick glasses. This combination caused other kids to make fun of little Christine because of her looks, causing Christine's self-esteem to plummet. Luckily, Christine's mother, Lori, was able to kick her drug habit and was found able to care for Christine and her brother again. By this time, though, Christine was 17 years old already. Lori remarried and moved the family to Clear Lake City, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston. Now, this suburb was considered to be great surroundings for safely raising a family, with it being on the wealthier side. Christine enrolled there in the local Clear Lake High School. Because Christine was bullied so badly when she grew up, she tended to be quite shy and a little lonely up until this point, never really fitting in or making close friends. So she wasn't really known to be an open and bubbly kind of person. She just kind of kept to herself. But when she came home from her first day of high school in Clear Lake City, her mother said she immediately saw a shift in Christine. She came back happy and excited, telling her mother she had met the sweetest girls ever. They were called Rachel and Tiffany. Rachel and Tiffany fit the popular girl stereotype to a T, but the only thing they lacked was being mean to people that didn't fit inside of their popularity group. Rachel was described as being kind, generous, and artistic, and really loved helping out the underdog. Tiffany loved acting, was always in school plays, and said her dream career was to be a social worker. When the two of them met Christine, it just kind of clicked, and they spent a lot of time together, really bonding and forming a tight-knit group of friends. This friendship really brought out the best in Christine. She went from insecure to confident, was laughing a lot, found her creativity again, and was doing good in school. Because the three of them had gotten so close, Christine had confided in Rachel and Tiffany that she had been bullied about her hair and her glasses a lot and how awful those times had been for her. Rachel and Tiffany immediately picked up on how big of a deal this was to Christine, and they wanted to help. They gave her a total makeover. They went out and got her a wig that suited her. They did away with the thick glasses and got Christine to switch to contact lenses, and they showed Christine how to use makeup to her best ability. Now, obviously, this worked wonders on the outside of Christine, but it also worked on the inside. Christine felt so much better and much more confident, and everyone around Christine noticed the change in her. She became so happy, bubbly, and outgoing that she was actually voted Miss Irresistible by her classmates. Everyone loves a good feel-good movie in which the protagonist just flourishes, despite all of the struggles they went through. Now, if that is you, I highly suggest you decide to conclude this video here and click away, because I can honestly tell you, it's all downhill from here. Okay, so if you're still here, the decline begins when Christine meets Christopher Lee Snider. She was 17 when they met and Chris was 21. Now, mind you, Christine moved to Clear Lake City when she was 17, so that peak in hospitality and happiness she managed to reach wasn't a super long-lived thing. Christine and Christopher started dating, and from the get-go, Christine's mom and stepdad didn't really like Chris much. I mean, yeah, there was an age difference, but it was more than that, because Chris, at his young age, was already a known criminal. Chris had a multitude of charges against him, some minor, but also some pretty violent charges. And beside his less than clean rap sheet, he was also known to experiment with drugs a lot. Christine at this point wasn't like that at all. She was still the Miss Irresistible who mostly fell in line with the good kids like Rachel and Tiffany. So it's not difficult to imagine Rachel and Tiffany didn't really take a liking to Chris either when Christine introduced them. They were essentially from different worlds, and while Rachel and Tiffany didn't break ties with Christine because of her relationship with Chris, they did start seeing less and less of each other. Partly because Christine would bring Chris around with her and they didn't like him, so they didn't really want to hang out with him, but also because Chris was said to be isolating Christine from friends and family. We can never really be certain if it was Chris's intent to isolate Christine, but what we can imagine is that it was sped up due to no one around Christine liking Chris, and that Christine, because of this, would stop hanging out with people who were against her relationship with Chris. Chris and Christine's relationship is said to be mutually abusive and dysfunctional, according to Christine's mother, Lori. She said Christine, besides being isolated by Chris, was also raped by him. Chris's family confirms that their relationship was dysfunctional and said Christine was insanely jealous. In the Snider household, Christine became known as the Psycho, a situation indicating just how jealous Christine was is when Chris doesn't let Christine into the house, ending in Christine spending the night on the lawn in front of Chris's house, demanding to be let in, even trying to break in, all while telling Chris she would murder his entire family if he made her leave or call the cops on her. Chris, on his end, was said to be pushy and aggressive towards Christine and had a hard drug habit. As good of an influence on Christine, Rachel, and Tiffany had been, as detrimental was Chris's influence on Christine. Christine started fitting in with her friend group less and less, and the amount they hung out together further decreased. Rachel and Tiffany did still care for their friend, so they didn't cut all ties with her, and sometimes still saw and hung out with Christine, but it wasn't really as good as it was before. On July 18th, 2003, Rachel, Tiffany's boyfriend Marcus, and his cousin Aldebert were hanging out at Tiffany's place. There was no parental supervision at the house that day, which makes it the perfect place for these young adults to hang out. They invited a slew of other people to join them at Tiffany's place later that day, somewhere around 6 p.m. Until then, it was just the four of them, and they watched a movie, ate some pizza, and enjoyed life like millions of other young adults do on days like these. One girl they had invited, Brittany, she wanted to double check if the party plans for that evening were still on and rang Tiffany at around 3. Marcus answered the phone for Tiffany and told her Tiffany was in the bathroom and couldn't come to the phone at the moment. So Brittany hung up and she decided to ring Tiffany again at 4 p.m. This time there was no answer at all. Brittany didn't really think much of it at the time and figured they were just busy. Instead of trying to call again, she decides to just go over there at the time she would always come over, which was around 6:30 p.m. And when she gets there, there is a group of people who had also been invited to Tiffany's house. Now, the group knocks on the door, but there's no answer. The group does hear a TV on inside the house, but other than that, there is no sound coming from the house at all. They check to see if the door is unlocked, and it is, so they head in. Inside the house, they discover a gruesome murder scene. All 4 of their friends had died. The police are called in to investigate this heinous crime, and the investigators are confronted with the extreme amount of violence used during this crime. All 4 of the victims had been shot multiple times. Investigators determined this assault came as a complete surprise to the teenagers. They could tell by the way Tiffany and her boyfriend Marcus were still sat on the sofa with their feet up, like they were relaxingly watching a movie. Aldebert was found on the floor in front of the sofa. It was unclear if he got up during the attack or if he had already been laying on the floor when the attack started. Rachel appeared to be the only one who had moved during the attack. They found Rachel's body behind the sofa, and leading to her body was a blood trail that appeared to indicate that Rachel had dragged herself to her final position after she was already wounded. Near Rachel's body, investigators found a phone on which the numbers 9 and 1 were already entered, leading to the conclusion that Rachel had actually been trying to phone for help after having been attacked. Due to the amount of blood, bullet holes, and bullet casings, detectives knew there had to have been a large amount of shots fired during the attack. But it wasn't until after they finished processing the crime scene that they could tell that more than 40 shots had been fired during the attack. A great amount of those shots had hit the intended targets, indicating execution-style murders. Detectives discovered the fired bullets had come from 2 separate guns, leading them to believe there was more than one perpetrator involved. They didn't find the weapons at the scene, so they think the perpetrators must have taken them. When the autopsies were performed on the bodies of the victims, they found that only 3 of the 4 teenagers shared the same cause of death. Tiffany, Marcus, and Aldebert's deaths were determined to be caused by gunshots, but Rachel's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Now, mind you that Rachel also had been shot multiple times, but the attacker had found it necessary to also beat Rachel over the head multiple times, causing her to pass away from those injuries. One other remarkable finding during the autopsies was that both Rachel and Tiffany had multiple shot wounds to their nether regions, which sometimes indicate a sexual jealousy toward the victims. Now, as is customary, the police interview people in the neighborhood and ask them if they had seen or heard anything of interest the day of the murders. One neighbor told police he had heard loud thumping at around 3:30 p.m., which he had figured was maybe somebody working with a hammer. The thumping he heard were most probably the gunshots during the attack. Then there was this other neighbor who described seeing 2 people walk towards Tiffany's house. These two individuals were a man and a woman dressed in all black, with the woman wearing a bandana over her head, so the neighbor couldn't really describe a hairstyle or obvious clothing style to the police. This neighbor did help the police by giving a description of the two people so a composite sketch could be made, even though the neighbor thought it probably wasn't going to help much because they didn't really pay all that much attention to the man and the woman at the time. The neighbor did still remember the woman having strikingly large eyes, but other than that, couldn't really name identifying characteristics. Now, really lock this piece of information about a composite sketch being made into your brains because it will come back in the story later. Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Aldebert were well-liked members of the community, which left investigators wondering about a motive for killing these specific teenagers. When they start digging around in the lives of the victims, the only link they can find is the fact that Tiffany's boyfriend, Marcus, had sometimes been selling drugs. There are a lot of sketchy types involved in the selling and buying of drugs, and because there can be quite a hefty sum of money involved, maybe, just maybe, this could have served as a motive for killing the teens. Aldebert himself had only moved down to Clear Lake City 2 weeks before the murders, and it was to get away from the rough neighborhood that he came from. They did also find some clues that Aldebert may have been involved with some gangster-like types, but there were no viable suspects found that could have committed the killings in Aldebert's or Marcus's drug and violent neighborhood histories. Unfortunately, the investigation into this case went cold due to a lack of evidence and a lack of motive, and conversation about this case was starting to slow. Rachel's father, however, wasn't going to let the murder of his daughter go unsolved without a fight. He began raising money to help solve the case. He spent that getting the case and especially the composite sketches attention via posters, billboards, and broadcasts. And he didn't just rent a billboard or print 10 posters. Rachel's father rented out basically every billboard around Clear Lake City and continued his efforts for 4 years. This man is truly amazing. Now, because the case and the composite sketches were everywhere, police start receiving more and more tips about this case again. Now, mind you that in these cases, some tips, while with the best intentions, can lead police on a goose chase. They have to go through every lead and determine if it is baloney or an actual useful tip for solving the case. Well, in those hundreds of thousands of calls they get this one anonymous call via Crime Stoppers. In this call, the person on the other end says he thinks he knows who the female in the composite sketch is. So far, nothing new. A lot of calls coming in at that time claim to know the identity of one or both of the suspects. But as the caller continues, he tells them that he was in rehab with a woman he thinks he recognizes in the sketch. And during rehab, she had told him about the quadruple homicide case. She had told him a really detailed story about how she was involved in that case. She had told him that she had run out of bullets during the attack and had to hit one of the victims over the head in order to kill them. And that person was supposedly calling 911 when she did that. After the caller told that story, police were all ears. This story fits so bizarrely well with the evidence that they had recovered from the scene. They were really eager to speak to the woman who told the caller this story. The caller told police that that woman was named Christine Paolilla. Police run Christine's name through the system and find out that she is 20 years old at the time, and when they see her picture, they instantly see the similarities to the woman in the composite sketch. They see Christine has amassed a lot of charges since the time of the murders up until now, most of them drug-related, and she was known to have a severe heroin addiction. She was married to Justin Rott, and they did have a condo together, but to get to her current whereabouts, police needed to do some digging. Eventually, they found Christine and Justin at a motel in San Antonio, Texas. Now, of course, a murder scene is going to be gruesome and awful, right? But this motel room was the second time police officers are confronted with a downright horrible scene related to this case. Christine and Justin were both heavily addicted to drugs, and they had been holed up in the motel room for 9 whole months. Justin told police Christine literally hadn't left that room at all in those 9 months, and he himself would only ever go out to get food or drugs, and they didn't allow housekeeping into the room. Due to this, the room was incredibly foul and covered in blood from shooting up drugs and covered in dog feces. There were used needles, packs of unused needles, and even about 80 to 85 needles filled with heroin ready to be used laying out on the dresser. According to police, the room smelled as bad as it sounds. How did Christine get here, you ask? Well, after the murders happened, Christine was shaken to her core. She took the news of their passing incredibly hard. She didn't go out to work, was constantly crying, and had to sleep in her parents' bed because she couldn't stand to be alone at that time. Over time, this reaction faded, but she started to be more and more into drugs and eventually developed a drug addiction. Her and Christopher Lee Snider broke up because he ended up going to jail for some time, and she decided it would be best to be without him. After a while, she went to rehab for her drug addiction, and that's where she met her husband-to-be, Justin Rott. Justin had also been in rehab to get treatment for his drug addiction. Christine came out of rehab clean and with money. She had inherited a large sum of money from her father, which she could access when she turned 18, and thus the future looked great for Christine and Justin. They were sober and had the money to invest in a condo of their own. Soon after, though, Christine saw a news story on the TV about the anniversary of her best friend's unsolved murders. She supposedly called Justin in to watch, and as the composite sketches were shown on screen, Christine slowly unraveled. Christine started pacing the room, saying, oh my," over and over again. Then she stopped and stared at her new husband. "Does that look like me?" she asked him. After giving Justin this giant clue as to her involvement in the crimes, she soon told him what had happened that afternoon. In the version she told Justin, though, her role was minimal and passive. She said she and Chris went to Tiffany's house to steal money and drugs, which was all Chris's plan. Right before they were to go in, Chris supposedly hands Christine a gun. Once inside, Chris starts shooting, and Christine's gun went off by accident, after which she said she fired blindly whilst crying. After they left the scene of the crime, Christine tells Chris that she has to go back inside to make sure they're all dead, and that's when she found Rachel, still alive, trying to phone for help. With no bullets left in the chamber, Christine decides to pistol whip Rachel to death. Christine and Justin decide to stay together and go on the run for law enforcement without really knowing whether law enforcement knows about Christine's involvement or not. That is when they rented the motel room where Christine was apprehended. Now, while Christine tells Justin that she had a passive role, she does actually give varying accounts of what happened that afternoon. The evidence, together with the varying statements and Justin's testimony, were enough for Christine to be convicted of capital murder. She was 17 years old at the time of the offense and therefore was ineligible to receive the death penalty. Christine will be eligible for parole in 2046. Christine has never been 100% clear on her motives because she never really spoke about what truly went down that afternoon. But looking at the aim that the shots were in, that so many actually hit the intended target, the blindly firing doesn't really sound like a true explanation of what happened that day. Also, the bullets fired into the nether regions could indicate some sexual jealousy. And because we have heard that Christine was known to be extremely jealous, people have said that they think it is very well possible that Christine did have some jealousy towards Rachel and Tiffany, who were both gorgeous, happy, bubbly women. Law enforcement were very keen to apprehend Christopher Lee Snider as well, but in the search for him, he was eventually found deceased in a nature reserve of some kind, apparently having taken his own life while running from law enforcement due to the new attention on this case. So, what do you guys think? Were Christine's actions a product of her scarred early life, or do you think Christine is responsible for her own actions? Maybe a little of both? I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on the case. Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you guys would like to see more, please consider supporting my channel by leaving a like or a comment, viewing some of my other videos, or maybe even subscribing. I will see you in the next one. Bye.